We are often told that science is a meritocracy, a pristine landscape where the truth naturally rises to the top like cream in fresh milk. We are taught that if you have the data, if you have the proof, the world will listen. But history, when you blow the dust off the archived letters and the faded journals, tells a much darker, more jagged story. Sometimes the truth doesn't rise. It is held down by the heavy hand of authority. Sometimes the person who unlocks the secrets of the cosmos is not the one who gets to name them. Today, we are going to walk back into the shadowed corridors of the Harvard College Observatory in 1925 to meet a woman who held the universe in her hands, only to be told to put it down. Her name was Cecilia Payne. And to understand the magnitude of what she did, you have to understand what the world looked like before she changed it. In the early 20th century, the consensus among the titans of astronomy was absolute. The universe was made of the same stuff as the Earth.
The stars, the sun, the distant nebulae, they were all just celestial mirrors of our own planet. Iron, silicon, oxygen, heavy metals. It was a comfortable, geocentric view of reality. We looked up and saw ourselves. The idea that the stars could be fundamentally different, composed of something entirely alien to our rocky existence, was considered scientific heresy. Cecilia Payne arrived at Harvard not as a conqueror, but as a refugee from the rigid academic structures of England. Cambridge University had allowed her to study, to sit in the lecture halls, but it refused to grant degrees to women. She left everything she knew to cross the Atlantic, armed with a fellowship and a mind that operated on a frequency few could match. At Harvard, she didn't just look at the stars, she dissected them. She used the then-new science of quantum physics, specifically the ionization theory developed by Meghnad Saha, to analyze the spectral lines of starlight captured on photographic plates.
Imagine the scene. A young woman in her mid-20s, hunched over glass plates in a dimly lit room, peering through a magnifying loupe at the tiny, jagged patterns of light and dark. These were the fingerprints of the stars. While the men of the establishment were busy categorizing these stars by their temperature or their size, Cecilia was asking a more fundamental question: what are you? As she crunched the numbers, filling notebook after notebook with dense calculations, a terrifying picture began to emerge. The data was screaming at her. It wasn't whispering, it was shouting. The spectral lines for silicon and iron were there, yes, but they were dwarfed, absolutely overwhelmed by hydrogen and helium. Her calculations suggested that hydrogen was not just present, but that it was 1,000,000 times more abundant than anyone had ever imagined. She was seeing a universe that wasn't made of rock and metal, but of fire and gas. She had discovered the true fuel of the stars. She had discovered the primary ingredient of the cosmos.
It was a revelation that should have shattered the scientific world instantly. It was the kind of discovery that wins Nobel Prizes and immortalizes names in bronze. Cecilia Payne had written what the astronomer Otto Struve would later call undoubtedly the most brilliant PhD thesis ever written in astronomy. She stood at the precipice of a new era, holding the key to modern astrophysics. But she was standing there, alone. And looming over her was a shadow that was about to swallow her discovery whole. She had found the truth, but in 1925, the truth was not enough if it contradicted the men who owned the sky.
The antagonist of this story is not a villain in the traditional sense. He does not wear a black cape or twirl a mustache. Henry Norris Russell was a man of immense intellect and staggering influence. He was the Dean of American Astronomers, the director of the Princeton University Observatory, and a man whose word was essentially law in the scientific community. To cross Henry Norris Russell was to commit career suicide. He was the guardian of the status quo, the gatekeeper of what was deemed reasonable in astrophysics. And in his reasonable universe, the sun was made of iron, just like the Earth. When Cecilia Payne presented her thesis, this monumental document that rewrote the recipe of the universe, she sent a copy to Russell. She needed his approval. In the hierarchical world of academia, and especially as a woman in a field dominated by men in tweed suits, his endorsement was the only currency that mattered.
She waited for the validation that her rigorous mathematics demanded. Instead, she received a verdict that would haunt the history of science. Russell read her work, saw the data pointing to a hydrogen-dominated universe, and rejected it out of hand. In his correspondence, he told her that her results were clearly impossible. It didn't matter what the ionization equation said. It didn't matter what the spectral line showed. The conclusion contradicted the established dogma that the Earth and the Sun had similar compositions. To Russell, the idea that the Sun was almost entirely hydrogen was physically absurd. This is the moment where the Matilda Effect, the systematic repression and denial of the contributions of women scientists, shows its teeth. Cecilia Payne was a doctoral student. She was 25 years old. She was facing the most powerful man in her field.
She was caught in a devastating bind. She knew her math was perfect, but she also knew that standing her ground against Russell meant ostracization. She was looking at the truth, but authority was staring back at her, shaking its head. Under this crushing weight, Cecilia Payne broke. She did what so many marginalized voices have been forced to do throughout history to survive. She diluted her own brilliance. In the final version of her thesis, the same thesis that Otto Struve would call the greatest in history, she inserted a sentence that serves as a tragic monument to this injustice. Referring to her own discovery that hydrogen was the most abundant element in the stars, she wrote that this result was almost certainly not real. She called her own truth a lie. She labeled her greatest discovery spurious to appease the ego of a man who couldn't see past his own assumptions. It is a heartbreaking capitulation.
Imagine the psychological toll of discovering the secret of the universe and then being forced to write a public disclaimer saying you must be wrong because the great men say so. Russell accepted this recantation. The thesis was published, the degree was awarded, but the discovery, the soul of the work, was effectively neutralized. The world continued to believe the sun was made of iron because Henry Norris Russell said it was, and Cecilia Payne had been forced to agree with him. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a truth buried alive. History, however, has a funny way of resurfacing, though rarely as quickly or as cleanly as we would like. The tragedy of Cecilia Payne is not just that she was silenced, it is that she was right, and her silencer eventually claimed the victory. 4 years passed. 4 years of the scientific community drifting in the wrong direction. Then, in 1929, Henry Norris Russell conducted his own investigations. He used different methods, different approaches, but the universe, stubborn as it is, gave him the same answer it had given Cecilia. The sun was indeed made of hydrogen. The impossible result was, in fact, the fundamental reality of stellar physics. But what happened next defines the difference between a mistake and an injustice. When Russell published his paper detailing the composition of the sun, he did not begin by apologizing to the young woman whose work he had crushed.
He did not title his paper, Confirming Payne's Discovery. Instead, he published the findings as his own revelation. In his paper, he credited himself with solving the mystery. Yes, he included a brief, almost perfunctory mention of Payne's earlier work, acknowledging that she had found similar results, but the narrative was framed entirely around his authority validating the concept. Because he was Henry Norris Russell, the scientific community didn't question it. They applauded. For decades, textbooks and lectures referred to the Russell composition of the stars. He was hailed as the genius who discovered that the universe is mostly hydrogen. The man who had forced the actual discoverer to recant her work became the father of the discovery. It was a theft not of money, but of legacy. He took her intellectual property, scrubbed her name from the headline, and pasted his own in bold letters.
Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin, watched this happen.
She remained at Harvard, working tirelessly, often for low pay, and with titles that did not match her responsibilities. For years, she was technically a technical assistant, despite doing the work of a full professor. It took decades for the institution to catch up to her brilliance. She eventually became the first female professor to head a department at Harvard, fighting tooth and nail for every inch of ground she gained. But the damage to her early legacy was done. For a generation of astronomers, the fact that stars are made of hydrogen was Russell's discovery. It is only in recent years, as historians of science have gone back to the primary documents, back to that impossible thesis, that the fog has been cleared. We now see the situation with painful clarity. Cecilia Payne saw the universe as it was. Henry Norris Russell saw it as he wanted it to be. When he finally caught up to her, he stood on her shoulders and called himself a giant. Today, we return the name to the discovery. We remember Cecilia not just as a victim of her time, but as a titan who saw the light before anyone else dared to open their eyes. She proved that stars are made of hydrogen. She proved that the Earth is not the blueprint for the cosmos. And ultimately, she proved that while authority can suppress the truth for a season, it cannot extinguish it forever. The stars burn with hydrogen, and they burn with the memory of Cecilia Payne.